Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I know it's a busy time of year for a lot of people. It's exams, budgets, all of that. So much appreciation for attending. I just don't want to bug the slides. Okay, so let me start off by telling you a bit about AWID, my association. We're over 30 years old. We just celebrated a few years ago our 30th anniversary. We are an international feminist membership organization. So we have over 500 institutional members, mostly development agencies, human rights agencies, funders, academics, located in 156 countries. So we are very global, and they work at all levels, both the national, regional, international. We also have individual subscribers, or actually members, over 6,000. And our subscribers, so our information goes out to over 50,000 people. And we work in English, Spanish, and French. So all of our materials are available in those languages. In terms of what AWID does, we believe in the global women's rights and social justice movements. And we work very much in collaboration with them. And in terms of how we feel change can be affected, it's only by strengthening the global movement. None of us can do anything by ourselves, especially with all the challenges that we're faced with. So that's kind of our way of thinking about how we proceed and the work that we do. Okay, great. So first of all, I just want to clarify what I mean by religious fundamentalisms and what we understand by it, because there tends to be sometimes conflations which are not helpful. So religious fundamentalisms is growing all over the world. There's many different types. There's many different manifestations. But they do share some similar characteristics, which is why I'm using kind of globally that word. One is that it's very much the use of religion, tradition, nationalism, ethnicity, other identity markers to justify violations of human rights. The other characteristic is that that's usually done by coercion, whether it's social sanctions, moral policing, and of course violence, strategic violence for those who transgress norms laid out by religious fundamentalism. Also, pretty much every religious fundamentalism, so these are all shared, reinforce and in fact I would say radicalize patriarchy. And I'll talk a bit about that afterwards. And they also attempt to establish political, social, economic power and control. So this isn't really about religion, culture, tradition. It's more about power, money, and social control and political control. Yeah, you can move to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to give you some main points in case I run out of time at the end or you need to get out, so at least I'm doing this up front. So this is more about going a bit more about the understanding of religious fundamentalisms. So I touched on the first one. The second one is that this is a human rights issue. And I think to understand it just as religious extremisms is a red herring, because it doesn't also allow us to give a response that would be effective. So this is a human rights issue, and it needs a human rights response to it. It's not happening in a vacuum. It's part and very interconnected with all the global crises we're facing around the world. Growing inequalities, conflicts, displacement, scarcity of resources, degraded environments, enormous amount of money going to military funding, which is very ironic because it's mostly the Western governments who have huge budgets, the US being the first one, France, Russia, China, and yet they're the ones who are most pushing for military interventions to so-called challenge or reduce terrorism. Does anybody know the annual funds that go into military spending globally? Take a guess. A lot. $1.7 trillion a year. That could meet, just in 1 year, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, which are now changing, and I'll talk about that, 10 times over in just 1 year. So, that's, if you want to understand the drivers of fundamentalisms, I think we need to challenge all the crises that are leading to it. Also, really shutting down of civil society space, whether that's by fundamentalists or authoritarian governments, which also give them a good breeding ground, let's say, for fundamentalism. And of course, histories of power control, geopolitics that have given rise to them as well. Religious fundamentalism, without any doubt, is happening in all religions and in all regions, and I'll go into depth a bit on that. But we tend to focus so much on Islamist groups and sometimes Christian groups because that's more in the mainstream media, but there's so many other groups that are perpetuating violence. And sometimes it's not violence in the political kind of capital P here, so it's missed. So I will go a bit more into that. And, sorry. I would say actually, religious fundamentalisms are antithetical to religion culture rather than being part of them. Because what they do is pretty much introduce a foreign, often foreign and not indigenous, view of religion that is extreme, anti-rights, and gets fixed. So we know that culture, religion, tradition are all evolving entities, right? So there's always contestations, there's a dominant point of view, which is usually a patriarchal point of view, and it reflects the power in that society. But there's also anti-hegemonic views, which are often more progressive, etc. And people have the right. They have the right to retain the elements of culture, religion, tradition that they find useful for their lives, that they want to believe in. They have the right to reclaim, they have the right to reinterpret, and they have the right to discard what is not useful for them and reject it altogether. But religious fundamentalism takes away all of that. It imposes a singular version and an extreme version that it then becomes the only true way, and the only way of being, say, a good Christian or a good Muslim. My last point is that they're not pre-modern. So a lot of the times we think that religious fundamentalisms are going back to some idealized, 1400 years ago, for example, in Islam. They're not. They're going forward in a context that is very different to what it was 1400 years ago. They have a lot of funding in the groups. They have access to arms. They have a global reach with social media. And it's very easy for them to reach out to a whole, whole global community of people. And that's very different. It's very different, and that's why I say they're not reinforcing patriarchy. They're actually radically changing the social power and political power in countries. Okay, so what are we to do? I think, first of all, we need to take a stand against both racisms and religious fundamentalisms. We cannot pick one against the other. So we need to speak up against racist narratives that lead to hatred, that lead to xenophobia and intolerance, and then ultimately violence. And at the same time, we can never accept religion, culture, tradition as an excuse for violence. And I think we need to be careful that we do both of those things, because concentrating on one or the other will just breed more violence and hatred. The second point I want to say is that we need to break the cycle of violence. Every time there's a resurgence of violence in a fundamentalist context or within a religion, if we respond by an equal violence, military intervention, whether it's hatred, intolerance of those groups, attacks, we just go into a spiral that will be never ending. And somehow we need to break out of that. Secondly, we need to shift the lens. I think it's very problematic that a lot of governments and also mainstream institutions, media, etc., see this issue only from a security lens and as terrorism. Or, when it comes to actually disrupt the mainstream political sphere. If you shift the lens to a feminist and human rights lens, what you'll see is that these are human rights violations that are actually occurring decades before it comes to the political sphere. And I worked in a project called The Warning Signs of Fundamentalisms with women living under Muslim laws. And it was actually a global project making connections with what was going on in Eastern Europe, for example, and in different contexts, and saying, there are women who've been working on this for decades who can tell you how this starts exactly when it's first starting to arise. The control of women's bodies, and usually sexual minorities or those discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, are the first to feel the rise. And that's not visibilized. And if you think of it just as a security issue, then it doesn't even matter, right? It's not even considered violence. So we need to shift that lens. I think also that the rise of Islamist groups and the rise of extreme manifestations of violence has really eclipsed violence which is going on in other contexts and within other religions. And we need to really recognize that and see it as a global issue. Fourthly, and let me be clear on this because I sometimes get challenged when I say this, is that I think, the whole ideology or the whole understanding that the only way that we can counter religious extremists is by the religious moderates is completely flawed. It's devoid of power analysis, and it actually becomes a red herring, and it defunds and delegitimizes strategies that are working in very other diverse and holistic ways. So let me explain you why. There are so many feminist interpretations of religion in every context, whether you talk about Catholicism, Christian evangelicism, Islam, and so on. Why have they not made it to the mainstream up till now? It's because of power. We live in a patriarchal society, and as extremist groups grow, they get more and more powerful. So unless we change that and we actually address the drivers of fundamentalism, this is going to do nothing in my perspective. It's helpful to some extent when it works in a holistic way. And it does give people another understanding, but let me give you a concrete example. So we work with a group called Payman Trust in North Pakistan, who works on what they call de-radicalizing Taliban, essentially youth. And she said to me, what's the first thing when people recruit these young boys and men? They offer them $200, employment for the family, for example, in stitching jackets, like, how do you call it? Bulletproof jackets, that's what I want to say. And other work, for example, providing services for the group. And they give them a Kalashnikov, right? So they get power, they get money, they can do something for the family. And these young men who have never traveled outside their village get to travel and join a cause that gives them more power in a context where their masculinities are totally threatened. And they're losing every kind of power, whether it be economic, political. So, what do you do in that context? You can't just fight, you just can't counter it with feminist interpretations of religion or progressive interpretations of religion. So what they do, and I'm sorry if I'm taking a bit of time, but I think it helps clarify the point that I'm trying to make or illustrates it, is that they work with the families, and usually the mothers and the sisters, who are then left by themselves and actually quite unhappy that their family member has joined the Taliban. They work with the community to be able to accept them back and reintegrate them. And they work through the mothers. Often these young men will continue having contact with their family. They try to say, how this ideology is flawed, so more progressive interpretations, but they also give them an economic avenue to then say, okay, we don't need to be part of this movement. We can come back and actually reintegrate into the community. They give the mothers skills training so that actually it's more than just the men providing for the family, and that does give the women of the family more power and say. So they do all these other strategies combined with feminist interpretations, or progressive interpretations, not feminist. So that's what I mean. If you just counter it this way alone, which a lot of funders and governments are doing, and it's become kind of the flavor of the month or year for funders and governments, I don't feel it's going to have any effect. Dehumanization. I think this is occurring on both ends, right? So it's the fundamentalists who are dehumanizing anyone who doesn't fall within what they understand is the camp of humanity, let's say. And it's happening the other way around. So, no one blinks an eye if people, 100 insurgents were killed, well, there was collateral damage. No one blinks an eye. Or, I think, people feel that it's just the cost of reaching a better world. And I think as long as we continue to dehumanize people, whether it's with our interactions or with our strategies, again, we will never get out of the cycle of violence. Because a lot of people say, how is it possible that these groups could, stone a woman, cut off heads? And I think it's, they're dehumanizing those people, but we're dehumanizing them as well. These are people, and there is a context which, they grew up in and which feeds into what they're doing. Not to take away from, agency and personal choices, but that is a part of it. And then there are many brave activists all around the world challenging religious fundamentalisms. They're under threat. They're putting their lives on the line. they're faced with violence, and often they pay with their lives. And I think that for us who are living more in democratic spaces and have space for civil society engagement, space for advocacy to our governments, to raise awareness, we need to, A, start the work in our own context, but also work in collaboration with those activists. And I think sometimes we tend to think, well, I don't want to go there because I won't know how to work with them, so do no harm is the first principle. But I would say do no harm doesn't mean do nothing. We need to support them, and they need our support, but we also need to obviously ask them how we can do that. And sometimes it's by doing nothing, but sometimes it is, they want the profile of the issues, they want their analysis to get out there. We work with a program in our organization very closely that is called the Women Human Rights Defenders Program. And they actually work with human rights organizations to provide a gender-sensitive response, say Amnesty or Urgent Action, Human Rights Watch, to provide a gender-sensitive response to women human rights defenders, even to recognize that they are actually women human rights defenders. Yeah, because traditionally human rights defenders are labor activists, whatever, but men, right? So these are all the violations that we've documented. We did a global survey of 2,500 women's rights activists, pretty much maybe from every country except for a handful. And we collated all the data, which was a bit of a nightmare, but here it is. So you can see that, often we just think about maybe sexual reproductive rights, depending on which context you are, right? So if you're in a Muslim majority context, you think of inheritance, property, equal rights and family laws. But actually, if you take a global lens to it, there's violations of every single right almost that comprises the international human rights standards. And what grows as a result? So I mentioned some of these, but let me see if there's, this I haven't really spoken about, and that's very problematic. Because there's more and more of a conflation of even democratic, so-called democratic governments, or from secular countries, entering into the political sphere, being elected into office, and then being a very influential lobby group, and actually codifying their ideologies in public policy, which then affects the whole population. So, they're getting there often by democratic processes, but they're in fact actually really anti-democratic in the way that they function, because it's just an imposition of God's laws, which is, so-called God's laws, which is very hard then to challenge, and it's imposed on everyone, no matter what they may believe in. So I'll start off with some examples of the Christian anti-rights groups. This is a group in the United States. As you can see, they use, well, I guess we also, hope that our children embrace our ideologies, but they also tend to use children upfront in very strategic ways. So this is something that they're doing in terms of hatred against people who are discriminated on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So let me try to give you a bit of a snapshot of what's happening globally here. There's a rise in Christian evangelism fundamentalism, not only in the United States, which may be the one that we read the most about, or East and South Africa, but also Latin America and the Caribbean and Eastern Europe. So it's happening all across. One of the main characteristics of the fundamentalist evangelical churches is that they reinforce gender roles, unequal and patriarchal gender roles. They reinforce what is the traditional family, and we've seen this at all levels, and I speak a bit more about the international human rights level. So, for them, the traditional family is extremely important because it's the unit of society. And once they're able to influence that unit, they actually influence the entire society. And their conceptualization, of course, of the traditional family is very heteronormative, unequal gender roles, just comprising of a man, woman, and 2 children, or whatever, how many children. So not seeing, extended families, single mothers families, same-sex families, all the diversity of families that exist. The other thing that they also do is they focus very much now on issues of LGBTQ rights. And I'll speak a bit about that later, but that has been, it's actually a shift in the last 4 years. Because previously for example, in Africa, their focus was very much on HIV and AIDS. and abstinence, right? And there has been that shift, and perhaps I'll talk about it right now. So in our analysis and analysis of other groups, of course this is rising in very different ways in Africa, but one of the issues was that during the Bush administration, a lot of funding went to groups that were promoting abstinence as a response to the HIV and AIDS pandemic. And those groups got stronger. They got stronger in terms of funding, in terms of reach, in terms of the ideologies, the platforms that they could use. And when kind of there was a shift in government, these groups were now already strong. And because the funding dried out in terms of some of their funders, not completely, but somewhat, and their ideology that they were pushing, they shifted focus, strategic focus on LGBTQI issues, and often as a diversion in terms of the crises that were happening in their countries. A lot of people also felt that they lost ground, that they're losing ground in the United States on these issues, on same-sex marriage as well, as for example. And so they felt strategically it was better to focus on other places around the world where they could have more impact. And I'll give you an example of that going forward. I just wanted to point out one example of this is in Brazil, which is not a context that we know or think about much, probably because of linguistic reasons. But there are armies of God being founded in Brazil. There's openly evangelical fundamentalist Christians who are very vocal about their own policy, their own ideas about how policy should be formed around their beliefs, who are in office, can be elected to office, and a lot of the prayers now, or a lot of the political spaces now are beginning with evangelical prayers. So I just wanted to put it out there because it is a context that we don't think much about. And evangelical Christianity is definitely growing in Latin America, despite the power of the Catholic Church. God, I'm very behind. So there's a wonderful organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which some of you may know. They did a lot of litigations during the civil rights movement against hate groups in the United States, so they've been around for a while. But they do a hate mapping and a tracking of hate groups in the United States. So as you can see, they've tracked that since 2000, these have grown by 56%. And actually, this is an interactive map, so you can click on anything and they'll give you a listing of the groups and their ideologies. And they include, the white supremacist groups, but also more and more anti-immigration groups, anti-Muslim groups, black separatist groups as well. And they only record the active hate groups. So these are not just groups that are just, have a website or presence. They're actually groups that are actively spreading hate and violence through their ideologies. Okay, this was the example I wanted to give you. So CFAM is the Center of Family and Human Rights. You can mark the cooptation of human rights right there. But it's one of the most powerful anti-choice, anti-sexuality groups, especially at the United Nations level. Let me come down to here because I'm running a bit out of time. This was a communique that they sent out on the 10th of April, so very recently. And they're more and more focusing on Africa, on Eastern Europe, as I mentioned. So you can see all of the heads of organizations are traveling to two African countries, Austria, and they're preparing for meetings which are happening next year. So they're planning very much ahead, and they're speaking at conferences which are very high-profile conferences in these regions. If you can do the next slide. So this is part of the communique, and I'll read it out for you because I think it's terrifying and troubling. So they say, why Africa? Why are we going to Africa? This troubled continent is the scene of major conflicts between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. Advocates of the sexual revolution that have claimed millions of bodies and souls in the industrialized West and North have long viewed Africa as their next prize. They're pumping billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of man-hours into Africa to enslave their people to the sin and death of this pernicious ideology. And this is their European rationale. So it's the front of great evil today that the world has ever known. And they're spending also billions of dollars on questions related to human sexuality. And if I can give you a bit of background on this, because it's actually one of the organizations that attacks verbally our organization the most. And in 2001, they were putting out these Friday faxes, which is a very unfortunate name for them now, considering the advance of technology. And we in response, put out something that we call the Friday Five. to challenge some of what they were saying and to put out an alternative discourse. And just recently, I was at the UN Commission for the Status of Women in March, and both myself and my director who was presenting got verbally attacked by them as well. So, and it's interesting how they do it, because it sounds it doesn't sound sometimes like, sometimes they just come out with a stupid attack, like calling LGTB rights bestiality or something. But often what they do is couch it in human rights language. So they say we are pushing a radical bodily autonomy agenda where we're ignoring all other rights or issues, that we are funded by Western governments only and we don't represent anyone, things like that. So it's really an attack on both our agendas and ideologies. And in fact, just to clarify, not that I need to respond to that necessarily, but we work on economic justice issues, we work on financing women's rights groups and human rights groups all through the world by doing advocacy to funders, et cetera, et cetera. So, and as I said, we have a broad base. And they make themselves look, so they say, oh, and we have to go to individual people just to give us $5 and $10, where in fact their budgets are more than us. So, okay, so Africa, maybe I will say a bit more about this because it is the focus of this presentation, even though it's not the focus of my talk. So I think we can't forget, recent history, the LRA spreading extreme violence. It's actually, I think, known, and you probably know more about this, is one of the most forgotten conflicts until the Kony 2012 campaign perhaps brought it more to the mainstream attention. But of course, he's never been captured, still indicted for crimes against humanity at the ICC. And just look at the scale of the violence that they perpetuate, and it's actually still going on, even though their power has decreased a lot. They've shifted, or they've, made incursions besides Uganda into also neighboring countries. And just this year alone, it was recorded that they abducted 616 children as child soldiers and sex slaves for the movement. So it's not ended by any means, and they're driven by what they call it's a syncretic religion, but also that combines Christian extremisms with indigenous beliefs, like the Acholi people. I think are the ones that were more both impacted and formed part of their very extremist beliefs. And there have been, and they were establishing what they call the 10 Commandments of God. Let me just move on to the Ugandan more recent example as well. So you may have heard, because this was given a lot of publicity, that Museveni of Uganda, the president of Uganda, was trying to impose the death penalty for homosexuality. There was a lot of pressure both from Western governments as well as and social justice groups and LGTB groups in Uganda as well as others. So now they've annulled that because they thought they couldn't pass it through as easily as they wanted, but they've actually introduced another law which again criminalizes homosexuality. And this is in a context where 35 of 44 countries in Africa already criminalize homosexuality, and you can see the domino effect. So as soon as Museveni started to do that, all of these other countries thought or considered or tabled more stricter laws. And actually, there's a pastor from the U.S. called Scott Lively, who had done a lot of presentations and gone traveling all through Africa to try and promote his very extremist ideology, and especially with actually the government of Uganda. And now he's been charged with promoting hate, and he's in front of the U.S. courts. And it was actually, the lawsuit was launched by a group in Uganda to conjunction with a group in the U.S. So the growth of Islamism. So this is a RAND Corporation report, which is very much a security, kind of leaning towards security and anti-terrorism, but it gives an interesting figure of a 58% increase since 2010 in the number of jihadi groups. Some of these are affiliates, so it's not actually new groups, they're breakaway groups, but then some of them are new groups. These are all the countries that are feeling the marked increase in terms of both groups and political leadership. And I wanted to kind of just see how this divides up by region. So Africa, 8, Asia, 8. They're entering into the Caucasus and Central Asia as well, and we've had a lot of requests actually from women's rights activists in all those countries to say, this is a newer issue for us. There's women's rights activists who've been dealing with this for decades. How can we link up? How can we strengthen our responses? And of course, the rise in the Middle East. So some examples. I just wanted to give you some various ones because the focus has been so much on the Middle East. Brunei, the Sultan of Brunei, very much for a political reason to stay in power, introduced one of the strictest Sharia codes the whole world has seen. And Maldives followed suit with an announcement, and they're actually rolling them out, Brunei is. When the NATO troops withdrew from Afghanistan, we knew that the Taliban was going to gain more power and control. There's been an increase of 20% of violence in actually the number of women and girls, and also a lot of targeted killing of women's rights activists and politicians, police, women, etc. ISIS, I think people know the most about that. So, obviously a huge scale of violence that's affecting the neighboring countries. And then Boko Haram, where a lot of the focus was on the Chibok girls, and yes, in fact, most of the 276 girls have not returned. But since then, this has been going on for decades. That was just a flashpoint that came out in the mainstream, and in fact, it was mostly Christian groups that were under attack. But in 2014 alone, look at the number of people that have been killed, and how many have been killed this year. So it's something that's ongoing. Sorry, that's a bit of a repetition there. So I just wanted to point out the power and that ISIS has actually. So they're the most richest terrorist group in history, because they have control over a lot of land, with oil fields. They actually charge taxes when they control the land, of course from crime, abductions, etc. And they also receive funding from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, but it's very unclear how much and who else is they're being funded by. But I think their main revenue comes from the other factors. And of course, in March 2015, Boko Haram joined them. They pledged allegiance to ISIS. I'll go through these quite quickly. How much time do I have?
It's 9:45.
Okay.
So
I don't want to ignore Buddhist hardliners. Not only have they been persecuting the Rohingya people, the Muslim minority, for ages. They're actually the longest persecuted group now that have been tracked by the UN. But there's also a very prominent rise of hardline Buddhists, mainly the 969 movement. And they've also joined hands with the BBS, which is in Sri Lanka. So you can see the kind of alliances they're making. I wish social justice, human rights groups were making the same kind of strong alliances. We are, but we need to strengthen them. Or our governments, liberal governments. So they joined with BBS. And there's been so many people, Rohingya people mostly, pushed to IDP camps. And there is a lot of Saudi Arabian funding to to recruit young men from there. So you can see kind of how the spiral of subjugation, and oppression, and violence works. I just wanted to mention Aung San Suu Kyi, which I think her Nobel Peace Prize should be revoked. She has done nothing to really stop the persecution. She has said this is a balanced issue in terms of Muslims persecuting Buddhists and the other way around, which is completely untrue. And in a sense, I wish she hadn't gone into politics, because I think that has motivated her to take stances which perhaps she didn't as an opposition. So you can see all the examples in terms of the Buddhist hardline violence, as well as the BDS movement in Sri Lanka. And a lot of it is very recent as well, doesn't often make the mainstream. Okay, so this is a picture of Putin kissing the Krill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church here. So it's just a symbolic way of showing how close that relationship is, and how much the Orthodox Church has influenced the political sphere. Putin has very much used it politically, because after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and because of all the oppression around religion that was created in that context, there was very much a rise of religion and Orthodox Russian churches became more and more powerful, and I think people has very much used that as a way to both gain popularity, but also shift the focus of the extreme violence, the crime, the economic issues that are happening now in Russia. There's also alliances being made. So, the Christian Right held their World Congress of Families in Moscow. A lot of crackdown on abortion rights, of course, people discriminated on basis of sexual orientation, gender identity. We saw that with the Olympics. That was given more profile. But I wanted to point out the domino effect. So see, similar to Africa, once Russia passes, for example, the restricted access to abortion, and here you had a whole bunch of other countries that followed suit. So everyone who wants to ensure that their links or their ensure alliance with Russia because of political reasons. Okay, so I love doing this. We can't forget about that. Okay, so it's the third large landowner. Just to talk about how much influence they hold. They act as a sovereign state, so they send their delegations diplomatically. In the United Nations especially, it's very problematic, the Holy See, and I'll talk about that later. But they're not a sovereign state, and they don't actually have, in the UN, they have permanent observer status, but they're there, they're influencing the negotiations, they're forming groups with other like-minded, what's called like-minded countries. And just a bit about their sexual violence that's been perpetrated. Okay, sorry. That's going to come to the next slide. So actually, Vatican City has no characteristics of a state. They have less than 1,000 people, mostly men, almost no women and children, worst gender equality probably ratio in the world, if they were considered a state. They have no elections, obviously. The Pope is always in power. The next question comes. And their abortion policies, and this is what I mean by shifting the lens to a more feminist human rights lens, have contributed annually to the death of 47,000 women. And that's not considering morbidity issues where women are left with permanent damage because of unsafe abortions because it's not legal and they're criminalized. So I wanted to give you some examples. They're mostly the countries that completely criminalize abortion, even when it could save the mother's life, are located in Latin America, but not all. And actually, Dominican Republic is now starting to change its laws. It's in front of their Supreme Court, which is great. Theirs actually is considered, where it's criminalized, it's considered aggravated homicide, and we have hundreds of women who are in jail. Often it's because they had miscarriages or their access to unsafe abortion, and they're actually in jail serving sentences as long as 30 years. And this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of the sexual abuse. So the Holy See was brought towards in front of the UN Committee for the Rights of the Child and the UN Committee Against Torture for their sexual assault cases. And because they're a hierarchy, actually all the sexual assault cases could be connected up the line, and the responsibility actually was with the top bishops and the Vatican for those. So there was an organization that brought forward a case to the ICC, with the International Criminal Court, with 20,000 pages of documentation of thousands of sexual abuse cases, and how that was actually, that the Vatican was directly responsible for those. They shifted priests until the statute of limitations ran out. They covered pregnancies, they covered where charges could be laid, et cetera, et cetera. So they were asked to do all these things, open the file, give redress, hold perpetrators into account, and they've ignored every single recommendation until now. I can talk about Pope Francis if people are interested. Judaism. So a lot of the Orthodox Judaism is centered around dress code, gender equality. Divorce is very hard, and it's very segregated. And there have been a lot of incidences of violence against women, like throwing feces, terrible things happening to girls as young as 7 because of they don't think they're appropriately dressed. So there's a whole bunch of violence happening here as well that is really important to bring down. And it's not only in Israel, it permeates the world. So So I thought this was interesting in terms of what I was just talking about, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish papers traditionally don't publish images of women. So they airbrush them out, right? So you can see this is the march in Paris of all the world leaders after the Paris attack happened in solidarity. This is what they published. So they airbrushed all the women leaders out. And an Irish newspaper came out with a spoof saying that feminist newspaper photoshops all the male leaders, and then there's only, unfortunately, 3 women left. They actually even photoshopped like the mayor, the German chancellor. It was crazy. Hindutva. So, sorry, go back. So this is, every Valentine's Day, groups have come out with this perception that Valentine is against Hindu culture, tradition, and attack women who are expressing any, displays of love or heart, anything. They've been physically attacked. So this is a group in Hindutva. And with the leadership of Modi, who's been very closely aligned with very hardline groups that were actually perpetuating what happened in Gujarat, the program in Gujarat, there is a lot of fear that he's actually very aligned with the RSS, which has been banned several times as a terrorist group for perpetuating violence. And this is the second biggest country in the world. So I think we really need to see what happens with that. I'm just going to point out the movie. So the international human rights system, I didn't want to miss talking about this. We engage a lot in the human rights system, and I do specifically because we want to take, we have the privilege to have a space there, and we're accredited, so we often use that space to try and influence the processes that are really undermining the whole international human rights system. So there's been increasingly a recognition, I would say, since the first conference on Cairo, which was, 20 years ago now, of religious fundamentalist groups, an extreme rise. Both of states holding that ideology, but also very strong groups. I talked about how they're really undermining the universality of human rights, and you have to accept like every person has as the condition of being human, a right to hold to the universality of rights. You can't just say, well, they have one right but not the other because it's not accepted in our culture. And I'll be the first to say the international human rights system is flawed, extremely flawed sometimes, but it's the best we have, I think. And it's not only the system, it's the best, I think it's the ideal that most people can relate with in terms of freedoms, of justice, of respect of their own bodies and choices. So I want to come a bit to this because it's not only culture, tradition, religion that's used, but very much national sovereignty, anti-imperialistic discourses, neoliberalism. So it's basically saying the Western agenda is an agenda of sexual rights, of et cetera, and this is being imposed on us, and we actually don't care about this. We care about economic rights, and this is not according to our culture. So we have people like Saudi Arabia, at the last Human Rights Council I was in, they spoke and they said, I can't remember what was being discussed. It was freedom of religion or something of the other. And they stood up and said, this is actually goes against what the thinking and ideology of the Muslim world is. And I thought, really? Saudi Arabia? You represent the whole Muslim world? When did that happen? Okay, so, and they're completely co-opting, human rights language. So, they say that we are violating now not only the rights of the unborn, the soon-to-be born, but the right of life to thousands of, or probably more, hundreds and thousands of men and women who would have been born and that we didn't let born. So it's just the way that they're also formulating their discourses. So these are some of the trends that we're seeing, but I kind of referred to it. I wanted to speak about the African group because this is a bit more of the focus. So it's got a lot of strength. It's more than a quarter of the states. And often they vote together as a bloc, right? So it kind of comes down to the lowest common denominator in terms of recognition of progressive rights, if they do that. Some of the states tend to break away, and that's often what, there are progressive states like South Africa. It depends on the issue, but sometimes Botswana, Mozambique, and others, who don't agree sometimes with the African bloc positionality and break away, which is great. they tend to be unified also because of all the histories and the political concerns, but also as members of the G77. Okay, let me see what's important. They're often also very much allied, and it's strange because you see this at the international human rights level, but you don't see sometimes Christianity, extreme Christianity, Islamist groups, etc., are in conflict with each other. But at the human rights level, on like-minded issues, you always have the Russian Federation, all the Eastern European states that support them, the Organization for Islamic Conference, and the African group, especially when it comes to, say, sexual rights united. And then, of course, you have it's not a north-south divide completely. You have the European countries, depending on the issue. For example, I was in a resolution that was talking about drones that was put forward by Pakistan representing the OIC, and there was such a pushback from countries like the US, Australia, etc., because they don't want to sign on to something that restricts drones, right? Because they're the ones who are producing them and selling them. So I mentioned some of these countries, also Zambia, Ghana. And actually Uganda has been very problematic. They're the ones who are usually representing the African bloc, and obviously some of their recent political positions. And so often they're very vocal for and representing the whole continent or the whole bloc besides the breakaway states. So I wanted to show an example of the polarization that's going on. And this is one of the issues that, we can't make movement often. I mean, the Human Rights Council is by voting, so it's a bit better, but where there's consensus movement, agreements are not being reached, where agreements have been reached for decades around, for example, furthering CEDAW, the Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And you can see how it works out. So mostly the OIC countries, this was a resolution on the traditional so-called family, which on the protection. You can't give rights to the family unit. There's no such thing. It's individuals in the family who deserve the rights, or who are right holders. So they were completely changing, actually, the whole basis of the human rights system. And it passed, and you can see why it did. So the whole OIC, a lot of the African blocs, some of the countries, they just, kept silent at least, and didn't vote yes or no. And you can see on the flip side the countries that supported. So it actually passed by 14 to 26, which is the solution, where it was Russia, the Russian Federation, who introduced the resolution. But on the other hand, which is also a victory, the resolution of fighting discrimination that is based on sexual orientation and gender identity actually passed, and this was the second one, and it passed by a way more margin than the first one did. And you can see that it was actually forwarded by the Latin American countries. Argentina especially played a big role. And there were a lot of countries that actually supported it at the end. But you can see kind of the flip side, a bit of the flip side of the last one in terms of blocks. Okay, so can I skip over the post-2015 agenda? If people are interested, I can talk about it. Just to say that there's a morphing of I think people who work in development are very aware of the agenda. So the MDGs came to an end, the Millennium Development Goals. There was a lot of criticism right from the start that they didn't focus on a broader range of issues that actually the Millennium Declaration document did. So they focused on very few issues, only eight MDGs, and their indicators were very narrow and not actually reflective of challenging those issues at all. So only 3, I think, actually reached target. But now, with the post-2015 development agenda, they're working towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, which are addressing, I think, 18 issues. They haven't yet been finalized. They're going to be finalized in September. But I wanted to point out the links with fundamentalisms, religious fundamentalisms, and influence of the post-2015. So, for example, they wanted a specific goal on the traditional, well, they don't call it the traditional, they call it the protection of the family in the MDGs, which again was problematic for the same reasons that I spoke about before. They're very much involved in the process, and they're using human rights, and this has been a discourse for a while. So, right from the start of the negotiations of the UDHR, there was this tension between, roughly North and South, on why this was progressive realization in terms of mostly economic, social, cultural rights, and why this was kind of needed to happen right away. And this is something that's a tension that's flowing through the whole system still. So a lot of the dynamics are based on that, especially with the post-2015 agenda. Okay, how many development agencies are there in Durham? Can I get a sense? Should I skip over this? This is actually reflective of a research that we're doing right now. A lot of our constituencies are development organizations, and some of them have been very forefront in terms of their challenge and recognizing religious fundamentalism as an issue that's integral to achieving gender equality, or totally integral to challenging if you're going to achieve gender equality. And but a lot of them also recognize women's human rights as central to achieving rights-based development goals, but are not challenging religious fundamentalisms. So this paper was an attempt to kind of draw out all the analysis, make the links, and also give some recommendations. Don't fall into the trap of cultural relativism. Involve women, recognize that they may not be who's visible in the community, but you do need to consult with them on religion. Often their points of views are very different. Recognize that they're dominant in mainstream versions. Don't fall into like a lot of the humanitarian agencies. This happened in Haiti actually, where after the earthquake, the most visible and institutions that they felt had the most links within the community were Christian evangelical churches, some of who were doing great work, but some of who were actually spreading very problematic ideologies. And so if you don't recognize them and you actually give them money, when there is a disaster, it happened in Aceh as well with the rise of Sharia there, or what we call food for faith, and I can talk a bit more about that. So it's, they'll give you foods that you need to do X, Y, Z, here's the Bible. Oh, okay. So I've talked a bit about this because this is related with, fighting religion, moderate religion with extreme religion in terms of using faith-based organizations as the only way to do development. We need to support more coalition building within the development agencies themselves. And kind of also, the ones who haven't really tackled this issue, they need to collaborate with women's rights groups, for example, or LGBT rights who've been dealing with this issue for so long. And I think if they start right from now, from fresh, they're going to lose so much in terms of how effective their strategies will be. So we definitely need to work in conjunction. This is a 30-second video. Can I show it? Or we're totally out of time?
Maybe we want to go to Q&A.
Okay. Can you just go to the next slide? Because I'll just leave it up. I don't have to talk about it.
Okay, just because we're... Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
But I'm so thankful for the time because some people ask me to present in 10 minutes and I really, really struggle. So it's much easier to present for an hour than 10 minutes. So yeah, thoughts, questions, criticism, additions?